Raymond Brassier is a contemporary philosopher as a member of philosophy faculty at the American University of Beirut, known for his work in philosophical realism. He was formerly research fellow at the Centre of Research in Modern European Philosophy at Middlesex University, London. Brassier is the author of Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, and the translator of Alain Badiou's Jean-Paul, The Foundation of Universalism and Theoretical Writings, and Quentin Meillassoux After Finitude. I'm very pleased to talk to you, and I start with my first question, which is actually I'm interested in exploring the intellectual evolution that has led to your current philosophical perspective, let's say. Could you please tell us about the key experiences, influences, rencontres, let's say, and ideas that have shaped your thinking and contributed to your current understanding of the world? I ask this question because you have been also teaching and translating from Badiou to Marcuse, and you have written preface to Thomas Ligotti and Francois Laruelle's translation. So I'm sure they have influenced the shape of your thought.
Sure. Well, I mean, very simply, I entered academia relatively late, but I was very interested in contemporary French philosophy. I guess that was my initial area of interest. By which I mean, philosophers like Derrida, Deleuze, and others. So initially, I tended to focus on contemporary French philosophy, and that's how I became interested in people like Laruelle and Badiou, who were less well known. When I encountered them, they had a very interesting critique of their post-structuralist predecessors. And they defended concepts of truth and science in a very kind of interesting and original way. And basically, my first book was written under the influence of thinkers like Badiou and Laruelle, also Meillassoux, whose work I have translated, and gradually I became, although what had drawn me to them was their critique of post-structuralism, I started to realize that they still assumed certain premises, principally the rejections of Kant and Hegel and Marx. Their whole philosophical projects were circumscribed by a kind of a rejection of this Kantian Hegelian kind of paradigm, and it was reading the work of this American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars who led me to reconsider the philosophical significance, for instance, of Kant's contribution, and I started to see what was unsatisfying in the work of the French philosophers who had influenced me so much. And I started to rediscover what was genuinely kind of uniquely radical and profound about the philosophical trajectory that leads from Kant to Hegel. So I started, revisiting, rereading Kant and Hegel. I'd read them, as a student, but I'd also, in a way, taken for granted certain criticisms. There were certain kind of objections leveled against them that I simply kind of, took for granted and without questioning. And rereading them led me to kind of question the adequacy of some of these criticisms leveled against them. And it also led me, for the first time, to grasp the philosophical significance of Marx, because it was obviously Marx's work is directly indebted, to Hegel, but also indirectly to Kant's critical revolution. So right now, I'm writing a book in which Marx is, the central figure, and yes, so it's my
Right.
in a way I've gone from kind of this interest in French philosophy of the 1960s and 70s back to to Hegel and Marx in particular.
We come back to Marx later, but my question, kind of small digression here, is that what was the source of unsatisfaction or even dissatisfaction with philosophers like Deleuze and Derrida for you? Was it their vitalism, for example, in Deleuze, which was immediately unsatisfactory for you?
No, you have to understand, it took me a long time to understand them, and they're very complex thinkers, they're very kind of powerful and subtle thinkers, and initially I was fascinated by them. I was fascinated by them also because they seemed to represent, I guess, I was young, I was reading them in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they seemed to represent a kind of a cutting edge. They seemed to be the kind of the vanguard of European philosophy. I mean, that was very naive, but in my, I thought, well, that this is there's something kind of very radical about what they're doing.
Right.
And it took me, at the same time, I guess I'm temperamentally, averse to skeptical relativism, and it seemed that with deconstruction in particular, it seemed to lend itself, it seemed to kind of to be reduced to a kind of generalized kind of skeptical relativism, which I found not only kind of philosophically unsatisfying, but also I find it politically really objectionable, because it seemed to provide an alibi for a kind of liberalism. Okay? If totality, universality and truth are not only, epistemically suspect but politically oppressive, then it turns out that liberalism and capitalism as the economic system that kind of undergirds liberalism are the only kind of, alternatives. And that was always something I was very suspicious of. Although I was not then a Marxist in any kind. I mean, I had an interest in Marx, but I certainly hadn't even read Marx properly. So, and with Deleuze fascinated me because he did not seem to be, he seemed to be a philosopher committed to some notion of the absolute. He made these claims about, that he was an ontological philosopher, and it was only later that I started to kind of identify the commitment to vitalism and his debt to Bergson as absolutely central to his project, and also his Nietzscheanism, because all these French thinkers are Nietzscheans. In a way, I entered philosophy to try to find a way out of Nietzscheanism. I read Nietzsche as a young man and was seduced, but then I started to notice very quickly that with Nietzsche, it's kind of it's a web you never get out of, because you can interpret everything. You can interpret your life and your world in terms of this kind of Nietzschean framework, which is very incredibly kind of subtle and ingenious, but also flatters. In a way, it kind of flatters your vanity, because Nietzscheans always think of themselves as kind of as part of the elect. They never think of themselves as part of the the last man or the masses and so on. And in a way, it was the residual Nietzscheanism in these French thinkers, I think, that kind of really I found unsatisfying, because I had gone into philosophy. I wanted to kind of I was no longer simply content to repeat these Nietzschean kind of platitudes, and I thought I became suspicious of a lot of the things that Nietzsche says about the history of philosophy, about Plato, about Kant, thought, is it really, is it that simple?
Mm.
So that was, I think, a fundamental kind of motivation as well.
Right. Okay, interesting. Yet, I mean, the book that you're famous with is Neil Unbound, and I am really interested to hear your understanding of nihilism. Once I was writing my PhD, I also came across this concept because it's also important for humor. I mean, humor is an answer also to nihilism, to meaninglessness, right? So there was back then a book I was taking a look recently titled Nihilism Before Nietzsche.
Yes, the Gillespie.
Gillespie. It was published in 1995, and in the book, Gillespie argues that the roots of nihilism can be traced back to the early modern period, particularly in the works of thinkers such as Montaigne, Descartes, and Hobbes. He argues that these thinkers helped to establish a worldview in which traditional sources of meaning and value were undermined, leading to a growing sense of disorientation and disillusionment. He also examines the role of enlightenment in contributing to the development of nihilism. But it's not exactly the argument that you start in with the book. Yeah, so you're not you're sort of a defender of the Enlightenment, and how do you position your book? Because many writers have written about nihilism, and it's also a buzzword of a lot of people. You know? So what is your nihilism?
Okay. Well, in a way, I started to notice that the link between nihilism and enlightenment. I think Gillespie is right. But other writers, basically, I started to notice that especially in post-Heideggerian continental philosophy, the Enlightenment becomes this. It's not the origin of nihilism. For Heidegger, it goes way back, but in a way it's a kind of the final phase of this exacerbation of nihilism, the evacuation of meaning and purpose and value from reality. A process. The nihilism is the kind of the intensification of this process that for him started with Plato. But I was aware. But basically, I think I had a basic rationalist sympathies. I don't like mystification. I think that if you're rationalism isn't so much a question of like a dogmatic. I don't mean rationalism in the metaphysical sense that the world is an intelligible structure that we can know through reason alone what's the structure of reality, but simply that it's an antipathy to mystification. And to the kind of the pathos of the unfathomable and the incomprehensible, and that is also something I was very suspicious of. So in a way, I started to become very wary. It seemed to me that a lot of the critiques of enlightenment on the claim that it led to nihilism were problematic because their antidote to nihilism was some sort of, re-enchantment or remystification. That the world is somehow it's a mistake simply to try to to understand the world, or that there's something in it that must always resist conceptual comprehension, and that somehow this is the source of value. The reason that the world is meaningful or what makes the world meaningful is precisely that in it which resists conceptual comprehension. And this is something I was suspicious of, and I was suspicious of it for political reasons as well, because it seems to me that these kinds of arguments about the ineffable, the unfathomable, etc., are often the the default of reactionary politics. Like that's just the way it is. We can't hope to change this because there's reality exceeds our understanding. It's hubris to think that we can really comprehend the world sufficiently to change it. So that was I had this rather kind of antipathy to that kind of anti-enlightenment, critique or whatever. And so basically, the inspiration for the book was is it possible to affirm, not simply to kind of not to flee or shirk the nihilistic consequences of scientific enlightenment, but to kind of to embrace them without simply either kind of accepting a kind of naive positivism, a kind of utilitarian positivism and liberal capitalism on the one hand, or a kind of Nietzschean vitalism on the other. I mean, in a way, so the book was written, although it's not very clearly stated, but in a way, the book is it possible to find a way through, nihilism, without simply kind of accepting being a kind of, a naturalist, a philosophical naturalist who thinks that the world is just this kind of this blind kind of interplay of forces, and then you become a kind of a Darwinian who thinks that everything is about adaptation, but that quickly, first of all, it becomes a kind of metaphysics, and it becomes a metaphysics that is politically very, very pernicious. You naturalize the market, you naturalize capitalism. On the other hand, you've got the Nietzschean kind of alternative, where you get the alternative to nihilism is to say that life can never be judged, because life is every judgment is an expression or a manifestation of life. Okay, so life and the affirmation of life becomes the precondition for everything, and the way out of nihilism is simply to affirm, the chaotic creativity of life beyond purpose, beyond sense, beyond justification.
Right.
But that's also I also found that very unsatisfying, and although it's not, there are Nietzscheans who, espouse emancipatory politics, I also thought that it's an essentially reactionary position, which can be kind of, be lent a kind of progressive emancipatory cast, but in a way which is a bit superficial. So in a way, writing the book was an attempt to kind of, to attack both of those positions.
Right. Yet one of the philosophers you have been translating and introducing to the Anglo-American thought is Francois Laruelle. And so, interestingly enough, this philosopher has not written that much about difference. He's written about identity and indifference, and I'm reading actually what you 20 years ago wrote about him. I'm quoting you. You wrote about him as the most important unknown philosopher working in Europe today. I'm quoting you. But unlike the revolutionary, more often than not overturns tradition in order to reactivate philosophy's supposedly originary but occluded essence, the heretic proceeds on the basis of an indifference which suspends tradition and establishes a philosophically disinterested definition of philosophy's essence, or as Laruelle prefers to say, identity. So this disinterested identification of philosophy results in what Laruelle called the non-philosophical use of philosophy that remains constitutively foreign to the norms and aims governing the properly philosophical practice of philosophy. So my question is, what is the significance? I don't even use the use. I say, what is the significance of a philosopher who writes about heresy and not about revolution, who writes about indifference and being disinterested as a philosopher rather than difference?
Well, precisely, what first, drew me to Laruelle's work and fascinated me about it was precisely this, these striking claims, this rehabilitation of identity, against, the whole kind of valorization of, difference and multiplicity, etc., etc. Of course, what he means by identity is something which isn't simply the kind of, the contrary, the opposite of difference. And in fact, the fact that he had worked through these philosophers, I specifically Derrida, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, Deleuze, these were his primary influences. He was extremely interesting because he seemed to have gone through their work and kind of come out on the other side and discovered something new. And also his claims about science, because his claim about identity is tied to his claim that this, what he calls non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy, is a science, and science is precisely what resists philosophical comprehension or instrumentalization. So this claim that there is, it's possible to develop a science of philosophy on the basis of what he calls this, the identity of immanence. That was fascinating. It took me a long time to understand exactly what he meant. The practice of heresy for him, revolution is a philosophical trope because it's about overturning and reversal, and in a way, revolution is too dialectical for Laruelle. So it's kind of revolutionary thinking will always be bound up with problems of the inversion, of inversion and overturning, which actually fuel, which fuel philosophizing, this perpetual philosophizing, as if like philosophy is like the wheel upon which a hamster is stuck, and dialectic is what propels, the dialectical reversal is what keeps propelling this wheel, and the kind of the philosophical hamster is stuck in this wheel. So for him, revolution is a figure of stasis and not of radical discontinuity. What he calls heresy is a cut, but it's a cut that for him is more radical than revolution, because revolution involves, precisely because it's an overturning, it necessarily kind of, draws on, what it's trying to overturn, and can't help but retain some of what it is trying to break with. Whereas heresy, according to him, is this suspension which puts the world, philosophy at a distance, and allows one to to think and do something entirely unforeseeable from within the ambit of the world. So heresy is radical for Laruelle because it's a break, it's a suspension of the authority and in a way the completeness and comprehensiveness of the world, and an attempt to use the world to as the material from which to kind of unlock this something genuinely unforeseeable.
And is it like easy to reconcile it to Marx and Marxism then, or you have to reshape and reframe Marx?
Well, it turns out, so there are, Laruelle's written on, he wrote a book on Marx, and I read it at the time without knowing really knowing very little Marx, having read very little Marx. Okay? And now that I've read Marx, I think that Laruelle's project, in a way, is not, unfortunately, I mean, it's not, I think he's a brilliant thinker, but I think it's not as radical as it would like to be, in a way, because the way the articulation of immanence and transcendence and of philosophy and non-philosophy is still too abstract, and in a way, I think that what's missing from Laruelle's emphasis on immanence, the immanence of what he calls, the human, which is also something that I find very interesting. His defense of a kind of, not of humanism, but a kind of claim that there's something about the human that's never been thought or comprehended philosophically. This emphasis is too abstract because in a way it abstracts from social relations. And in a way, Laruelle, although he's critical of his post-structuralist predecessors, he does, like them, assume that the Marxian emphasis on social relations, that human beings are social beings and that human beings are always socially related, he relates that this claim tends to be reduced to a claim about intersubjectivity. The claim that social relations are intersubjective relations, and precisely for Marx they are not. I think that Marx's critique of Hegel and Feuerbach is the claim that social relations are based in relations of production which operate behind the back of human self-consciousness. So in other words, that social relations are not, can't be consciously comprehended or grasped reflectively, because there's something about them that remains opaque and completely kind of resistant to philosophical reflection. And that's what, so what he calls the class relations of production are these social relations which in a way can only be grasped through this complicated theoretical operation. And in that regard I think that Marx is ultimately, and what Marx means by revolution, social revolution, is something more radical than any of these French thinkers had seen, including Laruelle, although he's sympathetic to Marx, but I think his reading of Marx is indebted to Althusser on the one hand and Michel Henry on the other, who are both of whom are very kind of partial and one-sided readers of Marx. So all this to say that ultimately, I was drawn to Laruelle's radicalism, and it's fascinating. But as is often the case, I think that philosophers or philosophical claims that proclaim their own radicality or that present themselves as kind of radical and groundbreaking are not. They can actually kind of if you examine them carefully, they rely on premises which are questionable and which are actually not very radical.
Then where should we look for radicalism? I mean, like there is this dichotomy of, either being too abstract, like I will, or either being mystified, like in Heidegger.
Yes.
So then where should we look for this radicalism?
The point is not to look. Radicalism becomes affectionate. The point is not to be. Yes. Okay, the point is not to try to be radical or to be new or to be original, because these are just, in a way, part of the problem in the kind of in a way the cultural commodification of post-war French philosophy in particular was that it became associated with novelty. In a way, what drew me to it in the first place was its radicalism and novelty, because I'd heard in a way it was kind of marketed, culturally marketed, not by the thinkers themselves, but as the latest thing. This is the most radical thing, and I think that is part. Philosophy is enmeshed in capitalist culture and capitalist kind of commodification, and what Adorno and Horkheimer call the culture industry. And I think that part of the problem is that the premium on kind of on the most radical or the kind of the most the latest is the most avant-garde and so on it's actually kind of becomes fetishistic, and it prevents you from grasping the underlying issues, which the point is not to be radical. The point is to try to comprehend actuality, to comprehend our world, our reality, and I think that Marx saw Marx's account of how philosophy is enmeshed
Right.
in the world it is trying to comprehend, and without simply being able to understand its enmeshment through abstract reflection, is still very kind of powerful. So for Marx, the point is that in order for us to think and do things that deserve to be called radical or kind of unprecedented, we have to change our world,
Right.
just our social world, our
Right.
social reality.
Well, which is fascinating. I should say that, I mean, just the point you mentioned earlier, that this radicalism actually is nothing except a kind of Darwinism. I mean, like behind that there is this kind of constant adaptation to new
Yes.
circumstances. It's very capitalistic in the end of
Yes.
the day.
Yes, I mean, capitalism, it fetishizes novelty, but what you're getting under the guise of novelty, this is the latest and newest. It's actually always the same, So that what perpetual novelty is the repetition of sameness, because in a way nothing is transformed at the level of social reality, or the way in which we relate to ourselves and our world. So the latest gadget, the latest kind of developments in technology is always presented as, and in a way that the rhetoric of this is groundbreaking, this will change everything. There's a vested interest in seeing it. It's a smokescreen, it's a diversion. The more you pay attention to this, and the more debates you have about whether or not ChatGPT will change the world, the less attention you pay to who owns what and who's running things.
Right. Perhaps that's why I just hijack what you said. Is why you're talking about Adorno. I mean, the question of progress. You say that, in quoting you, the coercive and antagonistic nature of capitalist society is of our own doing. Part of Adorno's point is that recognizing this facticity allows us, which is an important word for you apparently, to see it could be changed.
Yes.
And allowance here is a minimal condition.
Yes.
It is at least possible to change these phenomena.
Yeah.
But of course, knowing that something could be otherwise does not suffice for us.
Yes.
To make it otherwise. It does not compel us to act. Thus, the self-reflection through which reason recognizes that what it looks to be given has been made by it. That nature continues to dominate it through the domination which it exerts against nature, perpetuates the autocracy of spirit unless it is supplemented by a practical act. End of quote. Does it mean, Ray, that, or does it imply that although reflection serves as the cognitive element through which the dialectic of enlightenment is understood, it does not serve as a medium through which it can be dismantled or subverted?
Absolutely, yes. Very simply, yes. And I think Adorno saw this, and in a way his quandary was that he saw that it's only by reflecting upon itself that reason or enlightenment can see that it is can see its own limitations in a way. In a way, it's like enlightenment wants to kind of expose, it wants to expose the facticity of what we take to be given. Okay, what we think is God-given is man-made. That's the basic kind of movement of enlightenment. But then, Adorno's kind of dialectical point is that even this kind of movement of reflection has a compulsive dimension to it, okay, because it's a way of nature itself is still at work in this compulsive kind of de-reification or exposure of the madeness, the fabricatedness of what we take to be given. And his claim and his own thinking is obviously reflexive, and he sees that there are social conditions which perpetuate this compulsive reflection. And in a way, his problem was that the social conditions for revolution, were not available. And he's writing in the mid 20th century, after the failure, the failure to realize philosophy. The opening line of Negative Dialectics is, philosophy lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. What he means is that, communism was supposed to be the realization of freedom, of human freedom, and yet the attempt to realize human freedom in the most radical sense, in this Hegelian sense, freedom is the freedom of self-determination, collective self-determination, spiritual autonomy. The attempt to realize this freedom led to hideous despotism. Okay? It led to kind of unfreedom. So for Adorno, the problem is that we can see this, but it's saying the social conditions for realizing freedom have lapsed, and his criticisms of the student movements in the 1960s were tied to this. He said, they think they're trying to realize freedom, but they don't. They don't realize how the conditions, the real social conditions for this realization are simply not available. So now the question is that diagnosis still correct?
All right.
And that's the question. I think that's the most important question. Because for today, yes, either he's right, but then reflection can only ever reflect on its own congenital inability to change the world. Okay, it can see what's wrong with the world, but not how to change it.
Right.
Okay, but that was Marx's starting point. Okay, and this is in a way Adorno goes back to philosophy. Philosophy lives on because the moment to realize it was missed, because the possibility of transforming the world, is no longer available to us. Right. So now we're compelled to reflect, to keep on interpreting, but we can see what's wrong with the world, but there's no way to see how it could be changed. And I think that, obviously if this diagnosis is correct, then that's a terrible kind of situation. I think the problem is that some people have a vested interest in wanting it to be correct because it fuels this endless, it fuels an academic culture industry, okay? And the culture, in a way, critique becomes institutionalized when, you can make a living by pointing out what's terribly wrong about the world, but also the impossibility of changing it. Yeah, then you become this kind of, and that's I think that's not acceptable. So there has to be. So the question is, and reading Marx is important because to see how is reflection itself. Perhaps reflection is wrong to assume that it can reflectively comprehend, how the world, the shortfall or the hiatus between interpretation and transformation in a way. And my suspicion is that, in a way, it's the ultimate conceit of reflection to think that it can reflexively comprehend the world's unchangeability. The question is that maybe we don't know, and that's not something that can be kind of conceptually comprehended. And
it's also, sorry to interrupt you, it's also the task of philosophy to dismantle such conceits.
No, because philosophy has to realize that it's people. This is Marx's starting point. Is that the real movement? Communism is the real movement. It's people struggling against the conditions that make their life unbearable. Okay, that is the datum. Okay, and that's what philosophy must take into account, is that the world is increasingly unlivable for more and more people. So it's not philosophy. Philosophy is not in a position to dictate what the ways in which the world is deficient and whether or not it's possible to change it, philosophy should be sensitive to the manifestations, the direct manifestations of people struggling to change an unlivable world. Okay, and then philosophy can either assist, can participate in that struggle. Philosophy is obliged to take sides. Okay, what you can't do, you either kind of say that those people struggling to change an unbearable world are right, they're right to struggle to change an unbearable world, or you say they're wrong, they're deluded, they're fools, they don't understand that the world is just the way, is unalterable, there's nothing to be done.
Right.
And I think my view is the former, that it's the philosophical task is to listen, to the voice, not even the voices, because sometimes these people are voiceless, but to see, to register these struggles, okay, and then to see, well, is there something? Can philosophy and philosophical analysis and philosophical reflection contribute, provide a weapon, that these people can use to transform the world?
Right. Well, perhaps I have to admit that I asked this question. I hadn't written this question. I asked this question because, as an Iranian, that question is in my mind. Like what happens in Iran is a revolution that's happening there, or is a conceit? Like you have geopolitics. You can look at geopolitics of what is happening in the Middle East, and then you have a kind of macroscopic view, and you say that no, it's not necessarily a revolution.
Yeah.
If so, it's going to be repressed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why it's a practical question for me. Like the sort of ethics of revolution, or ethics of recognizing or registering, as you say, revolution.
Yes.
Not to be conceited. Yeah.
Yeah. And the point is not, is this or is not a revolution?
Right.
That's an abstract question. It's not as if the point is, struggle is a better word than revolution. And the point is that if people are struggling against intolerable conditions and are trying to kind of change intolerable conditions, are they, either you kind of think that their struggle is legitimate and you want to assist them, or you don't, okay? And if you do, then, the task is to see, how the struggle might be effective, okay? How the struggle might be effective, okay? And then obviously, you might misapplying the word revolution, as happened here. Okay? Whenever everyone said, there wasn't a revolution here, there was a kind of an uprising against what was then an intolerable situation. It's only become more intolerable since. The point is that there's describing a struggle is also a political act. The words, the vocabulary you use to describe your struggle and the aims, what you're struggling against and what you're hoping to achieve, that's politics as well. And if you simply kind of, there's a kind of an attempt to call, in a way, to cheapen the word revolution, to describe everything as a revolution, in a way which prepares you for the inevitable failure of revolution. Because if you call everything a revolution, knowing full well in advance it's not going to succeed, then you can say, well, look, we tried too much. And then you get resignation. Okay, and you say, well, what's the point of revolution? Revolution never works. Okay, so therefore we must engage in kind of democratic reform. Okay, no, the point is that you must be very clear about. You should be very parsimonious in invoking revolution. And Marx he distinguishes between political revolution and social revolution. Political revolution is always unfolds at the level of the state of representation, of representation of interests and of rights. But what communism, as as a commitment to revolution, at the transformation of relations of production, is not is not a question of rights or representation, or kind of negotiating with the state. Okay, it means seizing. Okay, but it's whatever it is. It's not something that can be kind of carried out through kind of through the machinery of the state. But that okay. So then if you have to be clear-sighted about what you're struggling against and what you're trying to achieve. And if the state is a repressive state, it's not going to give you right. A repressive state, by definition, doesn't listen to, isn't going to be persuaded by if you kind of by civil rights and protests. I mean, states that that torture and murder and kind of brutally repress people are not kind of susceptible to persuasion. Yes, well, so I think very simply, I mean, I'm not, I don't want to simply disparage people. I think that there are, those two things I know. There are people, I think, there are people who are authentic revolution, people who are sincerely committed to social revolution, and I think that they are right to kind of to emphasize the worth of the word and to say we're not simply, as opposed to kind of reform or kind of an improvement in conditions, they say no, there's something fundamentally wrong with the situation, and a revolutionary transformation is required. I think that is politically salutary, but then again you have to be very clear-sighted in order not in a way to kind of to discredit the term and to devalue the currency of the term, which is important to retain, by indiscriminately applying it for rhetorical purposes. You have to be clear about if revolution is your aim, okay, if you're clear about that being the kind of the goal, you have to be very clear about what may not be revolutionary about your tactics or strategy. Okay, so you have to be, in other words, because you're fighting against, you're also at a disadvantage. You're an enormous, by definition, the odds are massively stacked against you. Okay, if you want to abolish the state, all the power and the resources of the state are stacked against you. So what you can't do is say that revolution is being elected. Okay, so like if you're engaged in a kind of a struggle against an oppressive state, you can't redefine the meaning of the word and say that if by gaining a few concessions or by gaining a few parliamentary seats, this is the first step of the revolution. No, it's not. Okay,
I see. I have another question, which is like indirectly about violence, but in philosophical sense. Yeah. So what's the relation between philosophy and violence? I asked this question through the lens of Brandon's genealogy, where I'm quoting you, as genealogy exposes the authority of reason as simply another iteration of the superiority of force. And then you say pouvoir, not poisson.
Yes.
Right? Now I'm asking, let me ask this question this way. Is it also listen to you talking about sophistry. Does sophistry commit violence? And is politics today founded on sophistry?
Well, okay, yes. So there's a sense in which the passage you cite, the claim that the force of the better reason is ultimately a kind of violence. That is the kind of a paradigmatic genealogical claim. And then you can, but for Nietzsche, that's not an objection. Of course, Nietzsche doesn't think that because he thinks violence. There's nothing wrong with violence. I mean, violence is not. It's only the weak. It's about force. Okay, so like it's only obviously you fear the violence of the force of the greater force of the strong, But Nietzsche does not judge violence or force. That's absurd for him. There's just kind of, there's the powerful and then there's the less powerful. And the term violence, which is a kind of a, a moral kind of evaluation of overpowering force, and it's an attempt to kind of, to denounce it, to condemn it. But from Nietzschean point of view, that's just another weapon of the weak. In a way, so from a strictly Nietzschean point of view, even the claim that the force of reason is just another kind of violence assumes a distinction between, power and violence, or force and violence, which he thinks is illegitimate. He says, no, there's just like, this appeal. You're distinguishing between a good force and a bad force, okay? And that is, of course you have to, but that's a distinction from your own vested interest, okay? So what you call violence is whatever is overpowering for you, is kind of inhibiting for you. But of course you're also engaging in violence against, and the whole point of the critique of the slave rebellion morality, it's the violence of the weak against the strong, the kind of the poisonous, the ressentiment, bad conscience, guilt. This is the kind of the violence of the weak against the strong. Okay, so, and in a way, there's no way out of this. If you retain these Nietzschean premises, I think you can never kind of validate, or kind of, the distinction between kind of force and violence. So in a way, my points, and what I think is helpful about kind of Brandon's critique is in a way he's pointing out how a kind of crude Nietzscheanism, genealogy for him is just a kind of a byword for a kind of Nietzscheanism, just becomes incoherent, okay? Because he's also pointing out that Nietzschean cannot be allied to emancipatory politics. You can't denounce violence if you're a Nietzschean. There's no perspective from which you could, or there is a perspective, but it's a self-serving kind of hypocritical perspective from Nietzsche's point of view. Violence, I think, is a normative term. You need a normative framework to be able to kind of distinguish between force and violence, or between justified and illegitimate kind of violence. And then I think this becomes a problem, or it becomes a kind of it's uncircumventable. You have to kind of, and in a way, if you're a Marxist and if you're committed to revolutionary transformation, you also have to kind of confront this problem, because it becomes ever more apparent that those who govern the world will never willingly give up their power. And in this country, the most painful, there was an attempt at a peaceful revolution, and I think it failed. I mean, I don't want to say, it's obvious that those who have a vested interest, in keeping things as they are, in owning everything, and who have enriched themselves by miserating everyone else, will not willingly give up their power and wealth. And that it just seems to be a fantasy to think that they will. So once you realize this, and once you also accept that there's a kind of violence that's being carried out by the oppressors all the time, it's not always visible and spectacular. It's not always the violence of the police and the army. It's the violence of people dying of hunger, or people dying because they can't get the basic drugs they need to live, as is happening in this country. Thousands of people are dying because they can't afford basic health care, which people in other parts of the world take for granted. That's violence. That's not an accident. It's not kind of fated by nature. They're dying because the rich are preventing them from getting the medicines they need to live. So that's violence. So once you realize that violence is a kind of a constitutive part of our social reality, then the question about violence or non-violence, no, I mean violence is all around us. The question is, what recourse, do we have against the violence of the ruling class, the oppressors? And it seems to me that the question is, what sorts of violence will be effective, not whether or not violence can be used, because yes, these people will stop at nothing to preserve what they have, and it's everywhere around you. You see this. So I think that this, and I'm not glamorizing. This is not to glamorize or romanticize. There's nothing romantic or glamorous about violence. It is terrifying and hideous. Okay. But also the people who lost eyes and fingers, the people who were shot by kind of the police and security, or choked, they've suffered all this violence, and then to tell them that violence is illegitimate, that we must pursue parliamentary means, is like, no, that's absolutely unacceptable. So I think that the question of the question of violence is kind of uncircumventable, and the question is about its nature and extent, and what the violence of those protecting themselves against the constant onslaught that they face is entirely legit. It's just self-defense, okay? When someone is trying to murder you and you fight back, to say you can call that, okay, you can say it's violent, but they're fighting for their lives, and people. It seems to me that there's something morally unacceptable about condemning, those who are fighting for their lives. Okay, and if someone is trying to murder you, and you fight back, okay, with whatever is at your disposal, you shouldn't be. It seems to me that, people, bourgeois intellectuals are not in a position to kind of to judge them, to tell them you shouldn't do that.
At this point?
Yeah. That's okay.
Okay, so I think I have like 60% of the questions I've asked, like 40% of them, like I think 4 or 5 questions.
Okay.
Like that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you. It's fine.
So, Marx, quoting you, attempts to absolutize Marx's break with philosophy, end up recording it philosophically by appealing to false concretions, consciousness, the body, indeterminate abstractions, utopia, redemption, or more often than not, a theological fusion of both. Precisely because it eschews undialectical absoluteness, Marx's breaks with traditional philosophy can only be properly grasped through the resources of philosophy. It resides in a double inversion. Marx overturns rationalism's subordination of the sensible to the intelligible, while simultaneously overturning empiricism's subordination of the intelligible to the sensible. So, what is in Marx that is, I wrote it, perhaps it's now naive because you explained it, but what is, I've written here, what is in Marx that is absent from Nietzsche?
I think Marx has, he started as a philosopher, and I think, he thinks that philosophy has articulated concept of human freedom, which is new, which is, he draws on Hegel here, but freedom is, the claim that human beings can determine the conditions of their own existence, and in a way that what human beings can become, what they're capable of, is not biologically predetermined. Okay, so although human beings are a part of nature, but they're this remarkable part of nature where nature can transform itself, where nature opens up to what is to what has not yet been a part of nature, as if nature is kind of transcends itself through humans, precisely insofar as they are a part of nature, not an exception to nature, not something outside of nature. And that's because human social production, the ways in which human beings materially reproduce themselves, alters nature and alters their own nature, their own relationship to nature. And that's what he thinks is novel. And this is something that, although in a way that there's a kind of an interest in kind of self-overcoming or self-transformation, which is common to Marx and Nietzsche, for Marx it's collective and social, whereas for Nietzsche it's aristocratic and individual. And for Nietzsche, I mean, in a way, for Marx, humans can become divine, can collectively become divine, can become, can remake themselves and their world in unprecedented ways, only by abolishing the class relation, by abolishing wage slavery. Okay, the enslavement of one part of the humanity to another part. Okay, the exploitation of part of humanity by another part of humanity. Whereas for Nietzsche, it's the opposite. Slavery is the precondition for culture. And this self-transformation and artistic self-fashioning is the preserve of this aristocratic elite. So they who need to be exempted from labor by slaves. So that's why slavery is the condition of culture for Nietzsche. And self-transformation will only ever be the kind of the preserve of the elect, of the few. And so they are completely opposed in that regard. I think Marx's view is not just it seems deeper and more cohesive, I think.
Right.
Because part of what Nietzsche has to do is he has to deny the sociality of human beings. He says this is why he insists on caste, and he says that there are different kinds. There's no such thing as humanity. There are different breeds of human, and there are like inferior and superior breeds. And slavery is a condition for breeding or cultivating superior humans. Okay, and I think that Marx, that's mistaken because it's a biologization of human being, which is, I think, both not only philosophically but scientifically kind of unfounded.
Right.
So I think that Marx is right that to emphasize the sociality of human being, and that human sociality has no biological basis.
Right.
Because although human beings are rooted in nature and are natural beings, natural organisms, the ways in which they organize to reproduce themselves changes their biological condition.
Right. So another question is like talking about irony now. On our way towards truth, and you're a sort of defender of truth and science, can we have any place at all for irony, or irony is from the beginning loaded with hostility to truth, and irony is filled with this kind of aristocratic view of this vantage point? I mean, I read something from Laruelle, something that you wrote about him and his understanding of decision. You say that the structure of decision is a formal syntax governing the possibilities of philosophizing. yet it remains unrecognized by philosophers themselves, not through a lack of reflexive scrupulousness on their part, but precisely because of it.
Mm-hmm.
End of quote. Can I say that if there is an irony in the works you are proponent of, or your own work, it is the irony seen as skepticism, an irony of limitation of human understanding, say like scientific irony, rather than a kind of existential irony that other philosophers are, or were, like from Kierkegaard to others, they were interested in. So do you at all believe in irony? And do you, not believe in irony, because we're all ironic in the end of the day. I mean, do you find it useful and effective in attaining truth, or in science, let's say?
Well, that's actually a very difficult question, because of, the philosophical valence of irony is something, I haven't worked on or haven't really thought through. I mean, I appreciate irony. I mean, it's not, I don't want to kind of condemn irony, and obviously I think that there's, whether in the Romantics or, or even in post-Nietzschean thinkers, there's this kind of, there's obviously kind of, there's a very kind of, irony is a powerful resource, a powerful kind of conceptual resource. I think I hesitate. I think, in a way, maybe it's an interesting question to what extent Hegel himself is a kind of an ironic thinker, or the role that irony plays in Hegel, because in a way you can read, I think that there's, contemporary readings of Hegel that try to kind of make Hegel more, kind of palatable, or try to kind of distance Hegel from from the aspects of his work which seem, unpalatable to a contemporary sensibility, i.e. the claim about absolute knowing, about freedom, etc., etc., is to make Hegel an ironist, to claim that there's a lot of, that the phenomenology is, all these reversals. The phenomenology is not a kind of a Bildungsroman, a kind of a narrative of progress, of gradual kind of the ascent to kind of, to the mastered absolute knowing, but about these constant kind of setbacks and unanticipated reversals, so that there's irony at every level. That there's a kind of, and I think.
But is there any unpalatable, let's say, unromantic irony in Hegel?
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, the question is too. I think that the question is whether you think that whether irony is conservative, whether it's a way of, whether it's a mode of kind of self-protection, whether it's a way of insulating yourself against a risk, in which case it's conservative. It's an instrument of self-preservation, or whether it's something that whether it involves a kind of a risk. And I think that irony would be objectionable if it's simply about, self-preservation. If it's a defense strategy, if it's a way of maintaining, of preserving the superiority of your vantage point by kind of pointing out, so that even if you're defeated, you kind of, you show your superiority to your opponents through kind of ironic self-reflection. That would be, it's not that that's not interesting, but I think it's kind of, it becomes predictable, and it becomes, again, it becomes formulaic, and it becomes a way of a refusal to take risks. And postmodern irony is a very, and I remember this because I remember, coming of age in the 1980s, and there were lots of debates about the kind of the increasingly paralyzing nature of postmodern irony, this endless iron endless ironization becomes nauseating, it's a way of showing how you are in the know or you're reflexively aware of something, but without being able to kind of, to change something that is kind of, I mean, you wouldn't need irony if you were able to kind of simply kind of overcome whatever is, is frustrating or impeding your desire. Okay? So the question is, to what extent, irony is the main cause of frustrated desire.
Right. But yet a lot of what you say is also applicable to humor.
Yes.
Like this conservative mechanism that you say, like coping up mechanism.
Yes.
Like cope with the situation, yeah. And but in a conversation between Jean-Paul Richter and Johann Friedrich Habeck from May 16, 1798, Jean-Paul is reported to have defined humor as follows. I read that because I think that humor and irony can also contribute to this scientific model even that we're looking for. So quoting him, he says, "But to find reluctantly the ordinary smallness of human nature, while one sublimely hovers midway between pain and elevation above such smallness, to express this is called humor, which offers the appearance of the sublime and the comic to one another." I mean, interestingly, Hegel even prefers comedy to tragedies.
Yes.
So another writer, contemporary writer, interviewing actually Paul Fleming, puts it this way. He says that humor begins with the attempt to overcome and move beyond the ordinary smallness of human nature, but in the sublime movement away from this disdained life, one recaptures finitude, the smallness of life, often against one's will, as I said, reluctantly. So humor emerges then from the contrast between the desired goal to rise above life and its achieved end, to be perhaps frustrated, which is very Schopenhauerian in a sense, yeah? So what do you think of this sense in irony, that it's like, like sort of, focuses on the smallness of human being, finitude, but not in a mystified way, or an abstract way, because that is the concrete failure of the body or mind or idea, yeah?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think the smallness, I mean, I love humor, and I think, my inclination, although, I mean, I don't have a kind of a worked out philosophical position on this, is that I do love humor, and I do think that humor is of inestimable value, and I think it's a sign of, it's peculiarly human as well. But I think that humor, I don't have a philosophical definition of humor, but when one talks about the kind of the contrast between the aspiration and if irony is the kind of the shortfall between ambition and achievement, someone striving for the sublime or the elevated and kind of falling flat on their face, I mean, then the question is the aspiration itself ridiculous? Because there's a way that can be very conservative to say that when we talk about human smallness, what do we mean? And I think that if we mean about, humor, it doesn't kind of generalize. It's not a kind of a condemnation of kind of of human vanity and human hubris. It says, it points out, the absurdity of a kind of conceit. I mean, in a way, it's not that human beings are small. It's like it points out that there's a kind of the comic character is someone who is self-important, but in a way that the disparity between their own kind of vanity or self-conceit and the reality is visible, and then what are we laughing at? We're laughing at their inability to see. But But then the laughter isn't necessarily laughter of contempt, because we see this in ourselves. We recognize this kind of foolishness in ourselves. We know that we too are prone, we have this, we're vain and we want to kind of to be perceived, in a certain kind of elevated and noble way, but we know that we're also deluding ourselves. So that, in a way, by revealing this to us, there's a laughter of recognition. You see, so you're not sneering at the person. You're not saying what a contemptible fool. It's the laughter of, like you say, well, I do this as well. And this is, I think that's valuable. And I think that humor can also, like, absurdity is, I think, a key trope in humor. Some of the funniest humor is, it'll introduce a kind of an element of absurdity, and in a way it's a tension between absurdity and convention, or a recognizable social kind of situation, or it will reveal the latent absurdity in something in familiar social convention, or point out a tension between, kind of mundane, prosaic reality and something surreal or kind of, hallucinatory about it. And I think that kind of, that's the humor I enjoy, because it's philosophically, it estranges the world, it defamiliarizes, and that defamiliarization makes you kind of wonder, and I think it's philosophically kind of, inspiring, because it makes you, it reveals to you the strangeness of something that you take for granted, and in a way you laugh, when you see how something which you just take for granted is actually really strange, is actually kind of, has this absurd component to it. So I think, that's not, I don't have...
Yeah, but interesting. Like I was wondering what you think is interesting points you just raised. I have like 3 questions to make it a bit happier. So, quoting you, rationality is sedimented in socially embodied discursive practices. From Brandon. Yeah, so in the quote. Can this statement? Sorry, that was a quote from Brandon.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So again, rationality is sedimented in socially embodied discursive practices, end of quote. Can this statement from Brandon mean that we need, or inevitably keep, we need to keep a relation in an inevitable way to the past? I mean, in Robert Brandon's, reason has a new side, namely this social nature, that you also emphasize. For him, the reasons that enter into practical reasoning and justification are public reasons whose content and practical purport is conferred on them by their normativity governed role in their intersubjective games of giving and asking for reasons, right? So the question, if it is sensible, hopefully, is in Brandon, that leads to a dialectics between authority and responsibility. Yeah. What do you think of it, and how do you explain it? I mean, especially this relation to the past, because past for me is more tradition than necessarily a time understanding of past. So, how does it differ from relativizing reason in a prevalently postmodern discourse? Because when we talk about like this kind of social nature of reason, immediately people think of like relativizing, and there is no absolute there to think about. And so I hope the question makes sense. And
well, in a way, I would say, I mean, the importance of the value of Brandon's work is to show how rationality is socially embedded. It's precisely not to relativize it, and I think that's a mistake. To those who kind of think that it is, they don't understand what he means by sociality, because they think that they understand it sociologically. They think that it's kind of sociologism, just as there's psychologism. They think that you're saying that our rational capacities are relative to social customs and habits, and that's not Brandon's claim. He's saying that that in a way what is the normative, it's precisely the normative component of rationality, giving and asking for reasons, which is indissociable from our sociality, from our relations to one another. And that we can't understand that in a way that kind of that rules and habits, where rules are kind of are normative and habits are merely conventional, are bound together in a way that he gets this from Sellers, is that only the claim would be that only a creature capable of acquiring habits is capable of following a rule. That's Sellers' kind of great kind of mantra, that it's precisely our rationality is bound up with these kind of our interdependence, our social interdependence, and how we need to learn how to behave, in these ways, so for very kind of practical reasons. But then something extra, something new emerges from this.
Right.
So we learn to, because there's a difference between knowing how to follow a rule and simply obeying convention. And it's that difference that kind of Brandon is pointing out, and he's not collapsing one into the other. He's showing how most animals, there are social animals where there are habits and patterns, but there are no rules, and it's not ants are social beings, but they're not kind of they don't inhabit the space of reason.
Right.
Maybe they do. Maybe he's wrong, but as far as he's concerned, they don't. But because they don't have this, I guess, this reflexive relation to rules, where you can doing something, because of a rule or a rational commitment, can't simply be understood at the level of pattern-governed behavior,
Right.
where you're kind of kind of socially compelled to do something.
In Berlin, I was talking earlier in Volkshochschule Berlin, you were talking about part of the talk you had on absolutes in liberalism. Do you think that new absolutes are going to render philosophy even redundant and useless? I ask because somewhere there in the talk you say that, I'm quoting you, there is an intimate link between the impulse to philosophize and to think the absolute. That's what you say, yeah? And you add later that the current philosophical currents, the current philosophical trends have relinquished or jettisoned the absolute. End of the quote. You believe that there is a Hegelian point that you can not de-absolutize something without re-absolutizing something else. What do you think has happened in the new forms of absolutizations, or what? How do you map them?
Well, I mean, I think that the Hegelian point is very simple. It's simply that in order to relativize something, you have to relativize to something, and you have to kind of exempt something. You have to exempt one term from relativization in order to relativize another. And the question is that in these, even in forms of philosophy that that take themselves to be kind of criticizing or rejecting absoluteness or transcendence, there's always they have to smuggle it in, so that even and the point is that even empiricism and skepticism have to rely on something, or there's always some datum which is has to be held as absolute. Okay, the immediacy of sensation. Okay, immediacy becomes a code for the absolute, something that is like just, you know, kind of unquestionable, you know, not susceptible to kind of to doubt or to justification. And I think well, I guess I was talking about in contemporary kind of, you know, continental philosophy, like, you know, forms of, there's lots of talk about, you know, whether it's about, you know, life or relationality or whatever. Like there's always, you know, I think there's an absolutizing of relation. Like you have a metaphysics where you say everything is related to everything, but then what you're doing is you turn, you know, the term relation becomes this kind of, you know, master signifier, this master term, which is somehow is an absolute. Okay, it's something that is always functioning and always articulating everything, and it's the nature. How it acquires this status is precisely not interrogated. And the point for Hegel is that you can't get to the absolute, you know, from at the beginning. It comes at the very end. You can't just help yourself to the absolute. The point is to understand how things relate to one another, and to understand how to exhaust the ways of interrelation, so that you see that ultimately relation itself becomes absolute. And then the absolute is not like a shot fired from a pistol. And what he calls, and this is why the absolute for Hegel is not a thing, it's not an object. And the problem with, I guess, a kind of you know, an unreflexive invocation of the absolute is that you reify it, and it becomes this unexplained explainer.
Right.
It's something that, you know, you presuppose to explain everything, you know, while kind of carefully kind of, you know, keeping it out of you know, the glare of critical scrutiny.
I tend to say my last question, but I have another question that was interesting for me. I don't know if you still have time to. I ask very quickly. So Prometheus is a figure that's interesting for you, and on the other hand, Hermes. How do you see the difference between Hermes and Prometheus? In the sense that, like, for example, you know, for me, Prometheus is over-serious, blundering Prometheus rather than a sly Hermes. Hermes is sly, it's like laissez-faire, enjoying. Yeah. So as Louis Hyde notes in Trickmaster makes this word, says that the story ends with its hero in inexorable pain. Trickster, by contrast, is the consummate survivor, always slippery, always able to invent a situation, wriggle-free, always willing to abandon a project or an ego position if the danger gets too high. I mean, talking about conservatism and the role of humor and irony, I thought it is worthwhile to ask this question. Do you see the difference between Hermes and Prometheus as a significant difference?
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. I haven't written about this. I mean, look, I mentioned, so I wrote this essay about kind of, you know, Prometheanism, you know, and how, and what I had in mind was Marx as kind of, you know, the young Marx as kind of claimed that, you know, Prometheus is the greatest saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar. But the thing to remember about Prometheus is that he's a hero because he frees humanity. So yes, he's chained to, but Marx is not divinizing Prometheus. He's saying that Prometheus is punished by the gods, but he's saved humanity. He's liberated humanity. So the point is, the people who say, yeah, but look at how Prometheus ends up. He ends up kind of chained to a rock with a vulture picking at his liver. Yeah, but it's not Prometheus who's the hero for Marx. It's humanity. Like, you know, and so that's why I think that the contrast is. You know, and I think it's a mistake to make too much of this, and this is why in a way I haven't written I mean, I think that the kind of, I guess, the point about, I mean, Laruelle wrote about Hermes, and the thing about, it seems to me that self-preservation can't be the ultimate value. I mean, because that's the mantra of kind of, neoliberal capitalism. The self-preservation is simply, but the point is that because it denies our sociality for a start. So so to have a god, the thing about being a mediator, a messenger, an intercessor is good. But then surely it's the terms that are being related. The question is intercessor between what, mediator between what, and I think there's a danger of making Hermes like a figure of this kind of an ultimate kind of the sovereign individual in a way which I think is a bit questionable, because the point would be that humans, whatever individuality humans are capable of, depends on their relations to one another, and there are social conditions that prevent them from maximizing their individuality, and in a way the opposition between collectivity and individuality is precisely a kind of an artifact of unfreedom, of capitalist kind of democracy, which Marx is attacking. He says that contradiction between self-cultivation or self-development and duty or obligation to others is itself a kind of a historically specific contradiction. It's a mistake to think that it's essential to human existence. So I would say that, and as for the humor, I mean yes, I mean I guess.
Yeah, because Hermes is also the god of witticism, and
Yes.
wit, and wine, and slippery, and Juan.
Sure. Yes. It's an interesting to relate him to Odysseus in that. And Ulysses is the great. I mean, for Adorno and Horkheimer, he becomes a prototypical bourgeois subject because his wiliness, his cunning, is what allows him to survive and to kind of to get home. Okay, but home to what? Okay. I think, look, I mean, I take your point about, in a way, it's again, the point for Marx is that it's not the tragedy of Prometheus that is to be celebrated. Okay, it's the liberation of humanity, and that is not, that would be kind of, you're still seeing, to see things from the vantage point of the oppressor, or from those who kind of who presume to be able to adjudicate human destiny. Once human beings become, self-determining, once they have fire, okay, they can rival the gods, and then no one can sit in judgment over them,
Right.
and then no one can, they can't. Human existence and human becoming is neither to be is neither an object for kind of tragic, kind of, it's beyond comedy and tragedy.
Right.
In a way, so that, human history stops becoming a tragedy comedy. That would be the kind of, I think that's what, the point is simply kind of, because the claim that human history is either a comedy or a tragedy or some kind of mixture of both is precisely the kind of part of, in a way, the cynicism that prevents us, that keeps us,
Right. Yeah.
perpetuating the things that frustrate us, and not just, you're lucky if, Freud says that, psychoanalysis is just to kind of convert misery into ordinary unhappiness, but think of the massive misery, okay? And if you're, for the mass of human beings condemned to misery, neither tragedy nor comedy is, an appropriate kind of, they're not given the luxury of spectatorship vis-à-vis their own existence.
All right, okay. So my last question is about translation. You have been translating philosophers like Deleuze, etc. And my question is perhaps a bit abstract, but has correlation, which you have been discussing it, fighting it, is correlationism in philosophy. Now I'm going to linguistic correlationism. Has correlation ever made sense to you from the perspective of a translator, like the origin, like the language of the origin and language of the stem? So, I mean, like the failure of reason to adequately comprehend and find meaning in the world, the inability to communicate or translate something that cannot be translated.
Yes, well, translation was very important for me, and I have, enormous, sympathy for all translators, because I understand how difficult it is, but also how important it is. I think, in a way, I'm just speaking from my own experiences, that if I wanted to translate something, and it's because even no matter how difficult it was, I believed it was possible to translate. You don't believe that something is untranslatable. You believe that, because that would assume that, what would that mean? It would assume that there's something, any sentence, any word or kind of formulation, is part of a text. So the effect it has is tied to the whole. So to say that a part of the whole is untranslatable is also to imply that the whole itself is untranslatable, because in a way the part, collects and, refracts the whole. So I never believe, I just thought, there's things that are more or less easy. There's things that are easy and things that are very hard to translate. But even the most difficult component of a text has to be, translatable. There has to be an optimal kind of rendering of it. There has to be a best possible translation given its relationship to the whole of which it is a part. And that was part of the challenge and part of the excitement of translating, is finding, that's what makes it interesting, is the difficult bits. If it was easy, it wouldn't be interesting. So the correlation is, I think there is a correlation between, in a way, establishing a correlation is the productive and the creative aspect of translation. Is constructing something that can be correlated, something that plays the same part within this language whole as this fragment does in this other language whole. But that involves correlating the wholes as well as the parts.
Are you translating something now?
No, I haven't done it for a long time because it's too time consuming, and I'm trying to write, I'm trying to write a book right now, so all my energies are devoted to that.
The Marx book.
Yes, this is a book called Fatelessness.
Okay, Fatelessness. All right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for the time and generosity.
Thanks for your questions. I didn't answer your question about the past when you were asking me the Brandon question about the
if you like, I can after that. I mean,
it's I guess the connection is that the ability to reason is, you need to draw on the resources, because of, just as there's an interdependence between kind of habits or customs and rules, then in a way the discovering something new or thinking something new involves in a way kind of detaching those two kind of or widening the kind of the distance between those two times without ever severing it completely, which is why, and I think for Brandon, that's why when rational progress consists in, reinterpreting our predecessors. In other words, we can only, take a step forward, invent a new concept or a new way of understanding something, in a way by reinterpreting our predecessors.
Interesting. Thank you very much again. I say for not only for the time but also for generosity.